Are you saying you didn't notice? Really? Because let's not do that, let's not start there. You noticed, you just decided it wasn't worth mentioning. Not even to yourself. There was a moment, and you know exactly which one, where something felt slightly off. Not wrong enough to say anything, not wrong enough to make a scene. Just different. A comment that landed a little too heavy, a reaction that didn't quite match the situation, a look that lasted a second too long. You felt it. Right there in your stomach. That small, quiet pull that your body does when something isn't adding up. And what did you do with that? You explained it away. You gave them the benefit of the doubt, but then you gave it again, and again after that. Until giving them the benefit of the doubt became your full-time job. Unpaid, exhausting, and completely one-sided. That moment you brushed off. That's where this started. Not with something dramatic, not with something you could point to and say, there, that's the problem. It started with something small enough to ignore, and that was exactly the point. You remember that, don't you? Because confusion doesn't just appear, it gets built. Quietly, carefully, one small moment at a time. And by the time you felt it, and I mean really felt it, there were already 100 tiny moments stacked underneath it that you'd already excused away. So no, you weren't confused, not really. You were already adjusting, you just didn't have a name for it yet. Let me remind you the first time they pushed something. Because there was a first time, there's always a first time. It wasn't explosive, no. It wasn't some giant red flag waving in your face. It was small, deliberately small. Small enough that reacting to it would have made you look like the problem. And they knew that. Maybe they made a comment about someone you spent time with. Nothing aggressive, you know, just a little remark, casual, almost throwaway. But it sat with you longer than it should have. You noticed it, you just didn't want to make it into something. So you didn't. Do you remember they questioned a decision you made? Not directly, not in a way you could clearly push back on. They just a raised eyebrow, a pause that lasted a little too long. No, do what you want, and that somehow made you feel worse than a flat-out argument would have. You reacted calmly. Of course you did. Because at that point you didn't think it meant anything. That's the part they were counting on. See, the first boundary test is never about the thing itself, it's not about who you were with or what decision you made. It's about watching how you respond. I like to call it a calibration. They were checking how far they could go before you'd say something. And you, so patient, reasonable, giving them the benefit of the doubt, you showed them exactly what they needed to see. You let it go. Do you remember that, don't you? And the moment you let it go, that moment became information. Not for you, for them. And then their classic line, I'm not trying to control you, I just worry. Ah, worry. How sweet of them. That's what we're calling it. Listen, here's what nobody tells you about manipulation. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't sit you down and say, look, I'm going to start making you smaller now, just so you know. It shows up dressed as concern, as love, as someone who just cares a little too much. And you were touched by that, weren't you? That level of attention felt like devotion, it felt like someone who was really invested in you. I can understand that, but let's sit with that for a second. If you think about it, That tightness you felt when they made that comment. That wasn't you being oversensitive, that was your gut doing its job. That was every instinct you have firing at once telling you, pay attention, this matters. And what did you do? You didn't listen. You smoothed it over, you kept the peace, you told yourself it wasn't a big deal because you didn't want it to be a big deal. And just like that, without a single argument, without a single confrontation, the first boundary moved. Funny not funny thing is they didn't force it, they just waited for you to move it yourself. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because nobody told you to change. There was no instruction, no demand, no direct order. You just started shifting. On your own, quietly. Convincingly telling yourself it was your choice. You started explaining yourself more. Not because they asked you to, but because it felt safer than dealing with that look, that silence, that specific energy they carried when something didn't go their way. You became more careful with your words. You started editing yourself before you even opened your mouth. Running everything through a filter. Will this start something? Is this worth it? Let me just rephrase that. You know what? Let's slow this down for a moment. You were doing all of this, and they hadn't asked you for any of it. That's the part you keep glossing over. They didn't have to ask, you were already doing the work for them. You started avoiding certain topics, certain reactions. You shrunk your responses down to keep the temperature in the room comfortable. And all that for them. Face it, nothing for you, just for them. You excused yourself it was compromise, you told yourself it was maturity, you simply lied to yourself that you were just keeping the peace. But let's name it clearly what you did. You weren't keeping the peace, you were disappearing. Slowly. One small adjustment at a time. And here's the thing, they watched every single second of it. Well, let's look at what was actually happening. Because by this point it wasn't subtle anymore. I mean, you just needed it to still be subtle, because seeing it clearly meant you'd have to do something about it. And you weren't ready for that yet, or simply you didn't want to be. The pattern was already there. Repeating and rotating. Running on a cycle that you'd gotten so used to, that you stopped noticing where one loop ended and the next one started. They'd push, you'd adjust, things would feel calm for a while. Then they'd push again, a little further this time, and you'd adjust again, a little more this time. Think about it, no argument needed, no force required. Just you, adjusting every single time. Let me put it this way, the confusion you were feeling wasn't an accident. And let's be very clear about that, confused people don't leave, confused people stay and try to figure it out. Confused people give more chances, ask more questions, and blame themselves more often. And that confusion was the whole strategy. That's why very often they like to say, you're too sensitive. I was just joking. And you sat there puzzled wondering if maybe they were right. Very interesting. Of course they weren't right, but you'd already been adjusted enough by then to seriously consider it. Now listen, as it's here where it gets cold. The emotional pressure wasn't always loud. Think about it, it didn't have to be. Sometimes it was just a mood that filled the entire room. A quietness that made you feel like you'd done something wrong before you'd even spoken. A warmth that disappeared without explanation, and came back just out of the blue, leaving you so relieved that you never stopped to ask where it went. Am I correct? Let's just say, you were being managed. Like a temperature dial. Turned up just enough to keep you there, turned down just enough to keep you uncertain. Alright, I want to talk about the boundaries. Because by now you didn't even know where they were anymore. They'd been moved so many times, so carefully, always just slightly, never dramatically. Just enough that each individual shift felt almost reasonable. Almost. If you think about it and stack them all together, every adjustment, every explained away moment, every shrunken reaction, and what you get is someone who is completely unrecognizable from the person who walked into this. That person is you. You know that, right? Can you finally see it? They didn't force control, they didn't need to, they only needed you to adjust. And every single adjustment gave them more space, more room, more of you to work with. And the worst part? You were so focused on keeping things calm, on not overreacting, on being the reasonable one, that you handed it all over without a single confrontation ever taking place. Do you realize that? They never took anything from you. You gave it. Piece by piece, trying to keep the peace that was never really there. So here we are. Look at that. It all makes sense now, doesn't it? The confusion wasn't yours. It was never yours. It was handed to you, carefully, consistently, by someone who needed you confused because a clear-headed version of you was the one thing they couldn't control. Funny how that works. Every moment you spent doubting yourself, questioning your memory, wondering if you were too sensitive, too difficult, too much, that was the point. That was the whole architecture. Built quietly, built patiently, built specifically around you. You weren't losing your mind. You were losing your footing. On purpose. And the purpose was theirs. And now you can see the whole thing. The first comment that sat slightly wrong, the first boundary that moved just a little, the adjustments you made that nobody asked for out loud, the pattern that repeated itself so smoothly you almost mistook it for normal. Almost. Ah, that small little almost. Here's what nobody warned you about clarity. It doesn't feel like relief straight away, it feels uncomfortable. Because now the situation is no longer confusing, and confusion, as exhausting as it was also an excuse. No more confusion means no more comfortable story. So, you have the full picture now. You know what was happening and you know exactly how long it was happening for. You know what was real and what was carefully constructed to keep you exactly where you were. What you do with that clarity is up to you. The floor is yours.